World History. This is the 461T World History Unit 4 Part 2 Extra Credit Test Review. And I'm going to go through all of these various definitions and these various developments, and I'm going to go through the entire thing with you and answer all these questions and give you all these definitions. But, quick introduction. This test is a 25-question multiple choice test. It addresses three main topics: the Islamic Empire, the Tang and Song dynasties of China, and three of the major developments that contributed to the end of the Middle Ages in Europe: 100 Years' War, Great Papal Schism, and the Black Death. That's not all of the developments that contributed to the end of the Middle Ages. For example, we haven't discussed the Crusades yet. Now, I could just give you the answers and say this is the answer to this question and this is the answer to the next question. And if that's how you're trying to learn all this, then yeah, I can understand why this would feel very boring and frustrating. I would feel the same way too. So instead, I'm going to try to fill this in with some connections so that you can see that this is all one big unified story. If you can see the connections and the relationships between these developments, it's going to be a lot easier for you to spot the correct answer choices on that test. Now, to tie it all together, developments in the Islamic world, as well as developments in Tang and Song China, also contributed to the end of the Middle Ages in Europe, as well as the developments in Europe itself. So all of this comes together as one unified story. As we study these developments, we want to be aware of their ramifications for medieval society. Also, the Middle Ages didn't just end overnight. The Middle Ages' most recognizable institution, which was the feudal system, that hung around for centuries after these developments. So these factors that you're going to be tested over, they didn't kill the Middle Ages immediately, but they contributed to its gradual downfall. So let's start with these definitions. The first one right here, Middle Ages. Middle Ages, medieval period, Dark Ages, these are all interchangeable terms. They all basically refer to the same time period in Europe from the fall of Rome, that's close to around 500, until the discovery of the New World, close to around 1500. But like I said, these are not precise time frames. It's not like people woke up one morning in the year 1500 and said, hey, the Middle Ages are over. We pretty much confine the Middle Ages specifically to Europe because for many other people in the world, it was not an age of darkness. It was an age of light and prosperity and progress. Let's talk about Islam and Muslim. Keep in mind that the word Islam means submission, submission to the will of God. The word Muslim refers to a person who practices Islam. So the word Muslim literally means a person who submits to the will of God, or a submitter. A theocracy. This is just a quick review. We've studied this word theocracy before. A theocracy is a type of government in which the religious leaders run the government. There's no distinction between the religious leaders and the civic leaders, and that's how Islam started out. Monotheism, another reminder here. Monotheism means the belief in just one God. Monotheism is a critical part of Islam. Islam is a monotheistic religion to the extreme. And that brings us to polytheism. We've studied that a lot. By the same token, polytheism is the belief in multiple gods. And there is nothing that Islam can't stand more than polytheism. So let's talk about this Islamic empire right here. Muhammad was the founder of Islam. His recitations, that's his poetry, provided Islam's holy book. It's his teachings that are central to the Islamic faith. He is Islam's last, and therefore by extension, greatest prophet. Muhammad's life? For this test, we don't need to say much about Muhammad's life, but it is a very interesting story. He lived about 600 years after Christianity was founded. He lived from 570 AD or CE, if you want to use CE, to 632 AD or CE. He was from the Arabian city of Mecca, which was already an active religious center even before Islam. He was a highly successful military leader who united almost the entire Arabian Peninsula under the banner of Islam before he unexpectedly fell ill and died within just a few days, leaving the Islamic community scrambling to select a new leader, preserve Muhammad's teachings in written form, and to hold this fragile unity together. So, what were the teachings of Muhammad? The main teaching of Islam is that there is only one God and Muhammad was his prophet. God has no partners. All other gods are false. And Islam likes to keep things fairly simple. Not a whole lot of rules, not a whole lot of religious hierarchy, not a whole lot of ritual or ceremony. And it's not easy to keep religion simple. When it comes to religion, things can get complicated very quickly. For example, a good example of simplicity in Islam is these 5 pillars right here of Islam. Once again, let's keep Islam simple. If you do these 5 things, these 5 pillars, you are a Muslim. You don't have to be born into a certain tribe or race or country or family. These 5 things are, number 1, your profession of faith. The profession that God is one and Muhammad was the last prophet. Number 2, giving to the poor. Number 3, praying at the proper times. Number 4, fasting at the proper times. And finally, making the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca for a visit at least one time in your life. And that 5th thing is known as the Hajj. The Quran, what is that? The Quran, it's their holy book. The word Quran literally means recitations, as in reciting a poem. We recite poems. Poetry was a very popular pursuit in Arabia in Muhammad's day, and he taught his followers through the medium of oral poetry. He didn't write these things down. After Muhammad's death, his recitations were written down and compiled into the Quran. It is written in 7th century Arabic and only 7th century Arabic. Translations of the Quran into other languages are not considered to be real Qurans, and the Quran is considered to be the very words of God himself, given to the believers through Muhammad. Even though it contains a fair amount of biographical information about Muhammad himself and the various historical situations that he lived through, that doesn't matter. It's like, I'm God, Muhammad's my prophet, so I can talk about Muhammad if I want to talk about Muhammad. Islamic law. Islamic law, often called Sharia law, didn't just come from the Quran, but from numerous sources, such as, for example, the Hadiths, which are additional sayings and actions of the Prophet. The Hadiths are not holy like the Quran, and they are also assigned various levels of authenticity and trustworthiness. So some Hadiths are actually considered more trustworthy than other Hadiths. Let's talk about the spread of Islam right here. Now, remember that Islam spread in large measure, especially early, by military conquest. That's how it spread east all the way to India and west all the way through North Africa and into Spain and into the Balkans in Eastern Europe. But it didn't spread just by military conquest. For example, the Mongols, they weren't conquered, but many of them chose to convert to Islam. Islam spread to sub-Saharan Africa and Indonesia through missionaries and merchant traders, not by armies. But especially in the beginning, it was largely through military action that Islam spread like wildfire. So Islamic accomplishments. There was a wide variety of accomplishments in the Islamic world. For example, architecture. Islamic architecture is distinctive for its use of arches, domes, and minarets, particularly in houses of worship called mosques. Minarets are those tall, slender towers with a balcony from which the believers are called to prayer. Math and science. With the rise of Islamic caliphates, these independent Islamic kingdoms, many of these kingdoms were big supporters of sciences. Algebra is an Arabic word. They also made advances in such things as medicine, biology, bookmaking, literature, and art, such as arabesque and calligraphy. Geography and cartography, that is to say, map making. I mentioned at the beginning how developments in the Islamic world also contributed to the end of the Middle Ages in Europe. Islamic cartographers, Islamic map makers, had to make accurate maps about the huge amount of territory that the Islamic world had encompassed so quickly. They invented, for example, the astrolabe, which was an instrument that you could use to determine how far north or how far south you were by looking at the stars. They had the writings of Ibn Battuta, who traveled extensively throughout the Islamic world over many years. All of these accomplishments were going to be quite useful to Europeans during the coming age of exploration, discovery, and conquest, when the New World and new routes to Asia would be discovered by Europeans. The Tang and Song dynasties of China. Keep in mind that the Han Dynasty fell around 220 AD. Then you had about 400 years of political fragmentation in China. There was no Chinese empire. There was just a collection of lesser kingdoms. Then, in the year 618, dynasty, and we've talked a lot about dynasty made a comeback in China in the form of the Tang and Song dynasties. Political accomplishments. They managed to conquer lots of territories such as Manchuria, Korea, and Central Asia. And we saw a map of the Tang Dynasty, which looked like an hourglass because they controlled the area around the Silk Road as it went west through Asia. Remember that? Economic accomplishments. They managed to complete the Grand Canal. Now you might say, big deal. So they built a 1,000-mile canal. So what? But if you understand that this canal linked the food-producing areas of the South with the manufacturing centers of the North, you can understand how this canal supercharged the Chinese economy to make China very prosperous and economically powerful. They also had financial products like standardized metal coins and, this is really important, paper currency to make trade even easier and more efficient. They also encouraged trade in the handicrafts in China. Handicrafts means items made by hand in people's homes for sale to the public, often through a merchant. Technical accomplishments. That's right down here. Technical accomplishments. They had technical accomplishments which would greatly impact the Middle Ages in Europe, such as the magnetic compass, which, like the astrolabe, which I just talked about, would make long-range oceanic exploration possible for Europeans. They also gave Europeans gunpowder, which was going to put castles in great jeopardy in medieval Europe. Foot binding. We've shown pictures of that. It's not really what you would call an accomplishment because it's a rather cruel and destructive practice. Supposedly, tiny feet were visually pleasing, so they would bind the feet of female children so that their feet couldn't grow. And this was extremely painful. And at the end of the process, you're basically a cripple for life. That's a lot to go through just to satisfy somebody's notion of what beautiful feet are supposed to look like. But that's not the real reason it was done anyway. The real reason it was done was to keep women at home and deny them a public life. And finally, let's talk about weapons in Tang and Song China. A critical invention of the Chinese during this time, and I mentioned it just now, was gunpowder. China was on the receiving end of constant invasions and raids from Central Asia. It was a big problem. And that's why they built so many walls, like the Great Wall. But with gunpowder, they could make fire arrows and they could make rockets. And so you could use gunpowder to defend yourself from these foreign invaders. And eventually, gunpowder made its way to Europe. So let's talk about the end of the Middle Ages, the Hundred Years' War, church controversy, and the Black Death. Hundred Years' War. Hundred Years' War was fought between England and France. It actually lasted 116 years between 1337 and 1453. Feudal society underwent many changes during this period. We're just looking at some of the highlights. So why was the Hundred Years' War fought? Well, there were actually many reasons it was fought. I've got a lesson on it, which is on YouTube if you're curious. But the main reason is because the kings of England believed that they had a legitimate legal claim to the French throne, and they were at war in order to press that claim. So, what were the social ramifications of new war technologies, particularly with regard to the Hundred Years' War? These two new pieces of technology were the longbow and artillery. Before the longbow, the battlefield was dominated by medieval knights on horseback. Knights were lower nobility, and training and equipping a knight was enormously expensive. No one but people of noble birth could afford it. And knights, with their armor and their war horses and their training and their meanness, were unbeatable by the average soldier who came from a village or some town. Until the longbow came out. The longbow could shoot quickly, and it could shoot far, and it had enough punch and power to penetrate a knight's armor. It took a fair amount of training to get good with the longbow, but not nearly as much training and money as it took to produce a knight. And this meant that a common foot soldier trained with the longbow could kill a knight. And you could put a lot more longbowmen on the battlefield for your money than you could knights. The other development, thanks to gunpowder from China, was artillery. In other words, cannons. Artillery was bad news for castles. Before, the castle was the backbone of the feudal system. If people were inside the walls of a castle, you weren't going to get to them. But now, cannons could blow holes in castle walls. And so the entire feudal system depended on the dominance of castles and knights. And now, these two new weapons, the longbow and artillery, were going to make all of feudal society too unstable to keep together for very much longer. So, what role did Joan of Arc play in the Hundred Years' War? Well, we did a Google form on her. She wasn't actually mentioned by name in our PowerPoints, but Joan of Arc was a 16-year-old kid. She shows up at a time when the war was going so badly for France that they were on the verge of total collapse. And Joan of Arc shows up and she tells Charles VII, who isn't even king yet and seems to have no chance of ever becoming king, God has told me that you are going to be the French king and that you are going to drive the English all the way out of France. All you have to do is make me co-commander of your army, and it's a done deal. Charles literally has nothing left to lose, so he takes her up on it. And wouldn't you know it, her predictions start coming true. Over the next 3 years, she wins victory after victory. Charles does become king of France, and she puts him on the path toward total victory over the English in the Hundred Years' War before she herself is captured by some English allies called the Burgundians, ransomed to the English, and executed by the English as a witch. But even more importantly, Joan of Arc captures the imaginations of the French people and instills in them a sense of national pride and national identity that they didn't have before. And that sense of nationalism is going to spread far beyond France. And that's the impact of Joan of Arc. The Great Papal Schism, also known as the Great Western Schism. Keep in mind, we learned about a schism in 1054 that separated the Eastern Orthodox Church from the Catholic Church. That's not this schism. This schism happened much later, about 300 years later. So let's begin with the Babylonian captivity. What was that? From 1309 to 1377, the Catholic Church was headquartered not in the city of Rome where it started, but in Avignon, France. And during that time, the church lived in luxury and ease, and the Catholic Church had gotten soft and lost sight of its mission to spread the gospel and save souls and help people. So in 1377, Pope Gregory XI pulled the trigger and he said, "We are going back to Rome. We have been here too long." So that time in France was what was later known as the Babylonian captivity, even though it was in France and nowhere near Babylon. That didn't matter. We still call it the Babylonian captivity. And this led to this great papal schism. Only a year after moving back to Rome, Pope Gregory XI died. And the next pope, Urban VI, was extremely abrasive and rude and mean-spirited and unpopular. So those cardinals, and cardinals are the highest church officials below the pope, those cardinals who were French went back, the French ones, not the Italian ones, but the French ones, went back to Avignon and elected their own pope. And now there are two popes, each basically at war with the other. What do you do? What do you, the average Christian, believe? And how do you know which one is the real pope? Results of this great papal schism. Long term, the church lost a lot of credibility with the people. How is the church supposed to guide me spiritually and help me with my problems when they can't even solve their own problems? We also have, and we're just about to the end of this, the Black Death. The Black Death killed about a third of Europe at a bare minimum, probably closer to half, over a period of about 4 years, 1347 to 1351. And it came via, no kidding, trade routes from Asia, where it had also killed many people. It spread along trade routes throughout Europe. There was no germ theory. There was no cure. And it was actually 3 diseases at once, which made things even more confusing. So what were these social effects of the Black Death? Well, because of all of the death, labor was now in short supply. There were just fewer people around to work. And this was good news for serfs who had survived the plague. Serfdom went away in many places because serfs were able to demand to be set free or they wouldn't work. Keep in mind that a serf was basically a part-time slave who had to work for his lord for no pay a certain number of days per week and who was not allowed to leave the land he worked on. Once free, these former serfs were free to move about and sell their labor to the highest bidder. And this was very damaging to the feudal system as a whole, which depended on serfs being tied to the land that they worked on. And then the church and nobility. What was the impact on them? These two powerhouses of the feudal system, the church and the nobility, the two most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages, lost a lot of credibility during the Black Death. I mean, why couldn't the church appeal to God to make the plague go away? Aren't they supposed to have the inside track with God? Shouldn't they be able to pray the plague away? And likewise, your noble Lord, whom you served as a peasant. He was supposed to protect you in times of crisis. That was the deal. He had that nice, powerful, beautiful castle to protect you from invaders and raiders and bandits if necessary. So why couldn't he protect you from the Black Death? Why was he just as helpless as his serfs? So, anyway, those are the answers to these study questions. I hope you use this information to get ready for the test. And I hope you see some connections that maybe you didn't see before. And I hope this also helps you answer the questions more accurately and that you get a better grade. Thank you very much.